your video. Yeah, that's great. So fine, let's begin the resume the session. So we were discussing about trump up surgery, and where we heard about what uh, we heard about Mrs. Pomfrey, Tricky, and the writer or the narrator James Harriet, right, who was a veterinarian or a veteran. So who is a veteran? A veteran is a means a person who actually treats animals, right? So in that case, if we look into the in the first part of it, if you look into the first part of it, so what do we draw that in the first part? That gives us the idea that how uh, one day the narrator met. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So how one day the narrator means saw the tricky, and he felt worried, and he described, or he narrated the means appearance of the dog tricky, and he said that what how the tricky was looking like. So he discussed that tricky was looking like a blotted sausage, right, and a leg at each corner, his eyes bloodshot and roomy, and he also stated that how his tongue lolled from his jaw, right. He also gave a some remark about the tricky, that tricky's health was not well, right. He asked the reason behind it, and Mrs. Pomfrey, right, who was the owner of that dog tricky, uh, so who quickly explained that um, that what kind of a problem occurred to her dog, right? Tricky. So uh, she pointed that he was so listless. Mr. Harriet, he seemed to have no energy, right? So listless, no energy, and also felt Mrs. Pomfrey that the dog was suffering from malnutrition, right? So in that case, the owner, Mrs. Pomfrey, also given the message or given the diet of that dog. That what means how the dog has been given with what some of the little extra food between his meals, right, to give him strength, right. So that's the thing like malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks are called as a mm, some of the extracts which are given to the dog at given the dog in between the meal, right. So at the same time, when the narrator asked him that whether Mrs. Pomfrey cut down, whether Mrs. Pomfrey cut down the, what do we say, that cut down the sweet things, as the narrator already told her. So that's why she pointed, did you cut down on the sweet things? As I told you, it means the dog tricky love to eat sweet things, and that's why Mrs. Pomfrey used to give, also provide that. And it seemed also, or it assumed that earlier the narrator gave a warning to the, or gave a message to the Mrs. Pomfrey, gave message to Mrs. Pomfrey that to cut down on those of the sweet things or extra meals, right. So, and Mrs. Pomfrey also said that she did a bit, but at the same time she also pointed that when she found Tricky was so weak at that time, so Mrs. Pomfrey had to relent. Relent means continue. Continue whatever she was giving, right? So she was giving that love cream cakes, she was giving chocolates, right? So she could not bear to refuse him. Refuse whom? Refuse the dog whose name is called as
Tricky.
a tricky. Yeah. So in that's what the writer stated, that how Mrs. Pomfrey made the tricky pampered a lot, right? So after that, the narrator also said that I looked down again at the little dog, and the narrator said that that was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. So Tricky was greedy. Why? The writer stated that Tricky was greedy because any time or any hour of the day, right, or any hour of the night, any hour of the day or any hour of the night, if you give food to the dog, right, the dog did not had never been known to refuse, had never been known to refuse. It means whenever you give or whatever the time you give food to it, it would tackle a meal, it would digest the meal, it would eat the meal. And that's what the author stated here, that I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pomfrey had not mentioned. So Mrs. Pomfrey also hid many of the things. Hid means what? Hide, hid many of the things means about Ricky's food items, right, or diet. So even the writer or the narrator, James Harriet, who also said that whether means Mrs. Pomfrey uh, giving the dog plenty of exercises or not. Well, so at the same time, then the lady, Mrs. Pomfrey, stated that what she used to give, right, or called as what, he has his little works with me, as you can see. So the dog Tricky used to do some kind of a exercise, but at the same time, means the author also stated that Hodgkin the gardener, right, who has been down with the lumbago. What do you mean by lumbago? Lumbago is called as a kind of a muscle pain or a kind of a pain, means he was suffering from. So there has been no ring throwing lately. No ring throwing lately means called as a no exercises are done. Right. So that's what he pointed. Who pointed? Means the writer. Mrs. Pomfrey stated that. After that, what happened? Am I clear till this?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now coming to the next part, I think those of the part I taught you in the last class. Now let me point out what did it tell in the next, or how it was continuing. Uh, if you see that, the author stated, I tried to sound severe. I tried to sound severe means I tried to make myself control and also make something like harsh. Now I really mean this, right? I tried to sound severe means the author stated that I never wanted to make myself rough, right? But looking into the condition of Tricky, I really mean this. It means the writer turned himself a little harsh, little strong, and said that a kind of a threatening or warning voice. If you do not cut his food, write down, write down or right now, and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. Right. This is the message. Means the narrator stated to Mrs. Pomfrey, you must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. So that's what narrators means a suggestion to Mrs. Pomfrey. Right, as the narrator was the veterinarian, so or veteran doctor, so that's why he suggested that to cut his foot right now and give him more exercise and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill, right? So it means his condition is going to overs, right? In compared to that, give him more exercise and cut down his food right down. You must harden your heart, and you will find out that lots of problems will come or difficulties you will face, but at the same time, you must make yourself strong and keep him on a very strict diets, right? Mrs. Pomfrey wrung her hands, right? So it means called as like the manner of requesting, right? Like the manner of requesting and stating that Mrs. Pomfrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. Oh, I will. I'm sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She sat up she set up head down along the road as it determined to put the new regime. Regime means rule or principle into practice immediately. So the kind of a conversation both had made, who had made the author and the and Mrs. Pomfrey. and author gave some kind of a messages that cut down his food right now, give him more exercise, you need to make yourself hard, right? So Mrs. Pumphrey heard all those things and reacted like she was repent she was repenting, or called as she was means she was realizing that in an in a sad manner or in an apologetic manner. She hold her two hands, right, clasp her two hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet, I'm sure you are right. So but at the same time it is difficult, so very difficult. So finally what happened means Mrs. Pomfrey sets off, right, head down, go straight along the road, and while she was going, the author looked at her behind and found out that she was determined, she was so sure that she would definitely start doing the practice, right? So but what happened after that? I watched their progress with a growing concern. Right. So Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet day. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it would not be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. Now, if you look into this, so the author talked with Mrs. Pumphrey, and then after Mrs. Pumphrey went in a kind of a determination that she would start doing the kind of a practice immediately. And the author, when watched their progress with growing concern. So the author was watching that, right? So Tricky was tottering actually, right? Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed
Sir,
coat. Yeah, tottering means called as a uh, walking gaitly, or called as a kind of a movement, right? So Tricky was a tottering or moving along in his little tweed coat. What do you mean by little tweed coat? That's called as a kind of a coat which covered his body, and that's what the writer here stated. The dog had a whole wardrobe of these coats, right? So imagine that Mrs. Pumphrey pampered this dog too much and loved too much, like she made a whole wardrobe of coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days, right? So he struggled on. So who struggled on, right? So and
Tricky.
yeah, well, no, not actually tricky. You can't say that tricky. So the author stated that he struggled on drooping in his harness, right? So here tricky was, suffering from and getting the pain, right? Bending down in his, harness. So he doesn't have the strength, right? So he was struggling to recover or getting out of the pain, right? He was moving very slow actually, drooping is called as a, slowly moving. I thought it would not be long before I heard from Mrs. Pomfrey. Please understand that and also underline this. The author clearly pointed, I thought it would not be long before I heard from Mrs. Pomfrey. So author knew that very soon he would get a call from Mrs. Pomfrey. To whom did he get the call very soon? Now he would definitely get the call from Mrs. Pomfrey. Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
I thought it would not be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. So the author was so sure, right? The expected call came within a few days, and finally, what the author thought of, and that also happened. The author stated that the expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught, right? Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. You can say that what impatience and also a kind of a worried, right? Uh, so Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing. So based on her idea that what, why she was worried. Now why did she make a call to the doctor? Now she made a call to the doctor. She looked worried because Tricky was not eating anything. Tricky refused even his favorite dishes. Tricky refused even his favorite dishes, right? And besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug. He spent all his time lying on a rug. Rug is called as a kind of a carpet, right? So where he all the time lies, panting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting, or called as in a gloomy, serious manner. Did not want to go for walks, right? Who now Tricky did not want to go or move, did not want to do anything, right? Now this paragraph is clearly stating about the condition of the Tricky. The author stated Mrs. Pomfrey was worried. And why Mrs. Pomfrey was worried? Because Tricky was not eating anything, even the favorite dishes which was given to him earlier, and now when it is given, so he refused to take that. He was vomiting, he was lying on the rug or panting, and he did not want to go for exercises, did not want to do anything. The writer also said that I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period, as the Tricky was not interested to go for a walk. So that is where the author decided a plan in advance. He stated that the only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. Right. So the author made the plan to put Tricky out of the house for a period, right? So, and that's why he suggested that Tricky must be hospitalized, or Tricky should be taken to the hospital for about a fortnight, right? So, what do you mean by fortnight?
Sir, at night,
At least
means
fortnight,
for one night.
one night.
Sir, 4 night.
Okay, so for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. So, yes. So the poor lady almost swooned. The poor lady. Now, who is the poor lady here? The poor lady is called as a means
Mr. Pomfrey. Mrs.
Mrs.
Pomfrey.
Pumphrey, Mrs. Pumphrey, right?
Yes.
The poor lady almost swooned, right? So weakened and also worry on the kind of a condition. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day, right? The poor lady almost cried. Soon means referring as a crying. Why? Now she was sure he would pine and die. She was sure he would pine, means uh, he would pine and die. Yeah, means the dog would search for her and also die if the dog did not see means Mrs. Pomfrey every day. But the author said that the author took a farmland. The author made a kind of a barrier or borderline, or called as a means deadline. The author took a farmland. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him, that to take him out of the house and put him in the means hospital. In
Sir, farmland means 4 9.
but I took a farmland
Farmland.
that called as a made a complete or one line decision. You can say that farm line. So made a strong decision, you can say. But I took a strong decision or
Okay.
strong comment that what Ricky was ill, and this was the only way to save him, to uh, switch him to the hospital. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, right? Even without making any late, right? Without making any late. So put Tricky into the hospital, right? put the Tricky into the hospital. Am I clear till this?
Yes, sir.
Getting any confused, please do ask.
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay. But I took a farmland. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. That called as a. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay. And followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's welling. Followed by Mrs. Pumphrey. So while he was let Mrs. Pumphrey also cry. Welling. Welling is called as a crying. So I marched out to the car. So the author stated that he marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. Right. So finally, the day came when the author means, took his car or went to with his car or went to the car carrying the little dog wrapped means covered in a blanket. The entire staff was aroused and maids quickly in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, super bowl. So these are the things which are simply kept or made for Tricky, right? So it means when the author the day decided to decided to take a Tricky, right, by his car, right. So that day, what happened means not only he took Tricky with him, the little dog, covered in a blanket. He also took all those things which he was using in his day to day life and which Mrs. Pumphrey had given to him. The entire staff was aroused and mates quickly went in and out bringing his day bed. It means preparing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, super bowl, all these things which actually together or piled and put it in the author's car. So the author realized that his car would never hold all the stuff. The stuff like cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, super bowl. So the author started to drive away, right? So drive away means what? Put more before put more things of the dog. So the author started to drive away. As the author moved off or left, right, what happened? Mrs. Pumphrey with a despairing cry. Mrs. Pumphrey seems like what, hopeless, rejected, and started crying, right. Despairing means what? That's called as a rejected or called as a hopeless cry, right. That his dog was separated from him, from her. So sorry, her dog is separated from her. So with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats. Threw an armful means what? Holding means a huge amount of little coats of that dog, right. So means and that she threw. So she threw an armful of the little coats through the window, right. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. So obviously the author was driving the car and the dog was next to him. So the author looked at the mirror or looked in the mirror uh, before he turned the corner of the drive. He found that what Mrs. Pumphrey was crying, rejected, hopeless, and holding means armful of the little coats which she threw the window. Right. So I looked in the mirror because I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So whoever was present in Mrs. Pumphrey's house, so everybody was crying, right? That the dog was means the dog went to the means surgery. That's called as a hospital, or with author went to the means hospital. So out on the road, I glanced down. I looked down. So out on the road, so when the author looked out on the road, he looked down at the pathetic, looked at the pathetic little animal who was gasping. What do you mean by gasping? Breathing. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what is the meaning of gasping? What is the meaning of pathetic? So out on the road, the author looked down at the pathetic. Pathetic means called as a sad, right? Looked at the pathetic or sad animal who was doing nothing but a gasping. Gasping means that's called as a breathing or inhaling, like that, right? The dog used to do. So out, are you listening to me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Out on the road, I looked down at the pathetic. So that he looked at the pathetic little animal who was inhaling or breathing on the seat by my side. The author patted. The author patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to walk. Walk means called as a movie style, right? Like when you hold the dog and you try to make the dog a little pushy, right? So at the same time, you'll find out that the dog means moves his tail. Poor old lad. Poor old lad. It means the author is telling to the dog, poor old lad. I said, you have. Hello?
Mhm.
Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Ah, poor old lad.
Yes, sir.
I said, you have not a kick in you. I said, you have not a kick in you. But I think I know a cure for you. So the author here means gave a comment that what means he knew that what kind of a cure or treatment is necessary for whom, necessary for this dog. So that's what the author stated to the dog. That means the the dog has not a kick in him, but the author stated that what he knew a cure for that dog. Okay, the question is very simple to discuss. Is the narrator as rich as Tricky's mistress? Yes or no?
I don't know, sir.
What you don't know?
No, sir. I don't.
Mhm. Assume. What do you think then?
Sir, he may be rich as with a sticky mistress.
Mhm. Okay, so here you will draw. Yeah, so it's a big one. Do you understand all these things? Whatever I'm telling you. Hello?
Yes, sir. I'm understand.
Okay. Now,
Yes, sir. I'm.
mm, so next is called as is the narrator as Richard Strick's mistress? So we can assume that no, right? How does he treat the dog? Obviously, the narrator was worried about the dog, and the narrator wanted the dog needed the surgery. So that's why the doctor was too much. The doctor was also caring to the dog, right? Why is he tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest? So, whose answer we cannot even determine. I think these are the questions. Answer can be identified when we read the next passage or next paragraph.
Yes, sir.
Why does Mrs. Pumphrey think the dog's recovery is a trump of surgery? Again, so this fourth number question is giving the idea that the dog got the recovery, right? And the dog's recovery is considering as a trump of surgery. But why? Whose information also we can draw here. Now, it is stated that at the surgery the household at the surgery means that called as a place where the treatment takes place. Surgery means, so at the place, right, where the treatment takes place, the household dogs surged around me means what? That's called as the household dogs, all those dogs who were present there. So they all means surged, gathered around the dog, right? So gathered around the dog means Tricky. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes. Noisy pack means what? They were making noise or the sound, and they were nothing but a pack with dull eyes, right? So dull eyes means that's something called as a kind of a uh, uninteresting or disinterest eyes. Like who came to them, right? So and they were not interested enough to know about that, right? So but they gathered there when the author put down the dog, right? So the dog lay motionless on the carpet. So as it was means the dog was lazy and also did not move. The other dogs, after sniffing means what? Smelling, like that's called as a smelling round him for a few seconds. So all the dogs, right, the other dogs decided so that what, now Tricky was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So they did not find out any kind of a reaction from Tricky. So that's why they ignored and they felt like what, the the dog Tricky was uninteresting object because of its means motionless. It lays motionless. It means it does not move.
Yeah.
Hmm. Now after that, what happened? Yeah, I made up a bed. I made up a bed for him. Right. I made up a bed for whom? A bed for that dog Tricky. So I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box, right, next to the one where the other duck slept, right. So it means kind of a artificial home was made for the dog, right, who was also stay separated from the other dogs, right. For 2 days, the writer observed, kept an eye. The meaning of kept an eye is called as observe. The author observed on that Tricky, giving him no food. So, what the author was giving? Now, only plenty of water, right? At the end of the second day, the first day was gone, and the first day only given plenty of water. Second day, he started to sow. He started to show some interesting in his surroundings. So, the author decided to do some kind of interesting things with Tricky. What was that? Now, on the means some interesting in his surroundings, and on the third he began to whimper. He began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard, right. He began to whimper means make a competition, and that competition means between Tricky with the other dogs, or maybe means all those dogs who were present in the yard. So the competition was made among them. The author stated when the author opened the door, Tricky trotted out. Right. So trotted out means what? When the author opened the door, Tricky jumped out and was immediately engulfed. Engulfed means what? That's called as a mixed, right? Joint, right? So when the author opened the door, jumped out and was immediately mixed, engulfed, associated by joy, right? So who is joy? The grey hound and his friends. Whose friends? Tricky's friends, right? After rolling him over, and thoroughly inspecting him, right? Even so, joy who means went near to the Tricky and inspecting him, trying to know him. The dogs moved up down the garden. So means again, so not only joy, so it's also, right. Uh, means they all moved up. They moved up down the garden. So after smelling, Tricky followed them. So, but Tricky also made new friends. So that's why Tricky also went with him. Went with them. So rolling slightly with his surplus flat. Rolling slightly means called as a rolling slowly. Rolling slowly with his what? Surplus pad. What do you mean by surplus part? What is the meaning? Yeah.
That means extra fat. Extra fat.
Yeah, surplus fat means called as a excessive fatty. Excuse me. Excuse me. Excessive fatty. Later that day, so you would find out that how the dog was slightly moving with his excessive fat and mixed with the other dog, right? The author stated later that day, right? So that day in the late time, or called as maybe in afternoon time, I was present at a feeding time. Feeding time means when he was giving food to the dogs, right? So the author stated he was while Tristan, right? I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. Slopped the food into the bowls means what? Uh, Tristan went to the food and slopped. Slopped means smelled it, and then after he took the food into the bowls. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There, there was the usual headlong rush. There was the usual headlong rush followed by the sounds of high speed eating. Right now, food was served. So, slubbed means served. So, I watched while Tristan served the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong, right? Usual jam, usual competition that quickly happened, right? So, among the dogs, followed by the sounds of high speed eating. Every dog knew that if one of the dog fell behind the others, if one of the dog fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. So it is very easy. Like what? Now food was served. Now all the dogs have a one job, like to have their part of the food. Now what happened? As many dogs are there, so they all means all gathered in a place and they all started to take their share. Right? They make the competition among themselves. Right? And finally, what happened? Now means everybody is trying to get the last part of his meal. Right? Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, let it be. So I have some competition for the last part. Mm. So let's see that if this one is a. No, this would be a little big. So I think next class we will complete this. Is it okay?
Yes. Yes,
Uh,
sir.
okay, I'll give you some of the questions pertinent to the some of the questions pertinent